So far, we've played it a little safe on our property page. Yeah, we beat up our maps pretty well, but we should do the same to our Goalie API too. For starters, what happens when we go to a property that doesn't exist? In an ideal world, this shouldn't happen within your own app. All of your data is always minty fresh, and you shouldn't be linking to pages that don't exist. But there is just one problem. The internet has a really good memory. Remember that one crappy page you created 2 years ago? Yeah, chances are robots are still visiting it. The longer you have apps on the internet, the more crazy junk you have to deal with. So it's important your application doesn't have a nuclear meltdown when something doesn't go its way. Alright, go to a property page and add extra characters at the end of the URL and hit enter. Not too shocking, we get an error. Let's see how we can recover from this. Let's head on over to our Data API plugin. Our get home function doesn't handle any errors at all. Let's work on that. There are basically two levels of errors we have to account for. The first involves us getting a response from the API that wasn't expected, like a 404. In other words, the home wasn't found. The second is handling cases when we get no response at all. Usually, this is a bad internet connection or a faulty website setup, like a DNS error. Currently, we have no way on the property page to even know an error occurred. We need that somewhere to show some type of pretty error message. Thankfully, a fetch response has an OK property. It's true when the response is good, and false if something bad happened. Since we want that to be accessible to the property page, this means we can no longer just return a JSON object. We'll have to return a wrapper around it with metadata so we can make decisions on how to display the response. We could just return the raw response object to the property page. It would be really annoying to have to do await JSON every time we want to get a response. The boilerplate code would be everywhere. Let's create a new function called unwrap. Its main purpose is to prepare an object to be returned to our property page. Its only parameter is a response object. Next, let's move the JSON call over and make our function async. Now return an object that contains our JSON property. Okay, now update get home to unwrap our response and return it. And let's save. Now we just have to update our property page to use the JSON property. Since we're no longer getting a home object, let's rename home to response. Then return response.json for our home property. And save. Now refresh your property page. Go back to the good URL. Great, it still works. Now let's go back to our unwrap function and return more properties from our response. I mentioned earlier that response has an OK property. We'll need that to detect if an error occurred. Let's destructure that and add it to our object. So now we have a way to tell if any error occurred, but nothing to give us a clue as to what kind. Lucky for us, response has status and status text. Status is the HTTP status code from the response. This will be helpful when trying to figure out what status code to be returned to the user. For example, a 404 when something isn't found. Status text is a message that describes the status. Usually it's used in conjunction with showing an error message. Let's add both to our destructure and add them to our return. Now let's take another look at our get home function. It's kind of annoying to have the headers in the function call, and it's likely we'll need those headers for every API call, so rather than redeclaring them in every function, let's move them to an object at the top of our plugin called headers. Now pass the headers object as a second parameter of our fetch call. Remember, fetch takes an object, so wrap headers in an object. And save. Nice, that's much cleaner. So now we're taking the response, extracting the JSON, and returning only what we need to our property page. Let's go there now and handle some errors. Nuxt has a handy function called error that gets passed inside the context. It's used to trigger the error page. It accepts an error string or an error object with status code and message. Status code is the HTTP status code to return to the browser. Message is the message to display on the page. Let's start by adding error to our context structure. Next, we'll use the OK property we added earlier to detect an error. Now use the error function and pass it the status and status text properties from our response as the status code and message. And let's save. Now go back to your browser and open DevTools to the Network tab. Go to the bad property page you've been playing with. You should now see a pretty not found error page. Notice it's also returning the proper HTTP status code. This is important for SEO and crawling. A 404 is a strong signal to the search engines that this page isn't found, so they'll crawl it less often. What happens when you accidentally link to a bad page? Since it's client side in your browser, the HTTP status code is ignored, but your error page will still show up. Great! Now our app is a little more protected against unexpected problems. But remember, there are two error types. The last one we'll take care of is what happens when you don't receive an API response at all. Go back to your plugin and add a couple A's to the word Algolia. Save, and refresh any property page. You should see an unstyled error message like this. In production, this page would look a little different. Let's take a look. Go to your terminal and stop your dev environment. Then run yarn build. Then run yarn start. Refresh your browser. You should see an error message like this. To make sure raw errors don't contain any sensitive information, no real details are shown. But what if you wanted to show raw errors or your own version of this page? For that, we'll need to update our API plugin. Don't forget to stop your app and restart your dev environment. Go to your API plugin and scroll down to the Get Home function. When Fetch encounters a network error, it throws an exception. If we want to show our own message in the error page, we'll have to catch it. The problem is, our property page is expecting our custom response object, and there is no response to give, so we'll have to fake it. Create a new function called getErrorResponse. Its parameter will be an error object. We're going to return the same properties as our unwrap function. Since we know this is an error, everything is certainly not okay. So set OK to false. Status is going to be 500, which means an internal error has occurred. Set the status text to error.message. That's the error text coming from the exception that was thrown. Last, just to cover our bases, let's set JSON to an empty object. Great! Now all we have to do is wrap our fetch statement with a try catch and return the value of getErrorResponse when we pass an error to it. And save. Let's refresh our browser. You should see something like this. That'll do for now. Okay, let's change the URL back to normal. And save. Well, there you have it, all done. You know, I've always thought the main difference between a well-built enterprise application and an amateur one is how well it handles errors. Almost anyone can code for the best case scenario, but it takes attention to detail and resilience to handle the edge cases.